On behalf of Dundee University Review of the Arts, as well as the university itself, I'm delighted to welcome Michel Faber to our interview room here at the 2014 Dundee Literary Festival. Since the publication of his genre-defying debut novel Under the Skin in 2000, Michel has gone on to establish himself as a distinguished writer of fiction, winning critical acclaim for his Victorian-set novel The Crimson Petal and the White, published in 2002. As well as his novels, Michel has written 3 short story collections, the first published in 1998, and also enjoys an active role in journalism, most often in the form of fiction reviews. His latest novel, The Strange Book of New Things, from which he'll present a
Book
reading.
of Strange
Book
New
of
Things.
Strange New Things, I'm sorry, I always get that wrong for some reason. Of which he'll be presenting a short reading in just a few moments. Explores issues of love, marriage, faith and language as Christian missionary Peter Lee leaves his home and his loving wife Beatrice profoundly far behind, travelling to the alien world of Oasis to spread the word of God. So welcome, Michel, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. I will just read a little bit from near the very beginning of the book, so as not to give away any spoilers. "I'm going to the prayer room," he said. "Want to come?" "In a little while. You go ahead." He stood up and walked without hesitation towards Heathrow's chapel. It was the one place in Heathrow, Gatwick, Edinburgh, Dublin and Manchester airports that he knew how to find without any bother. It was always the ugliest, dowdiest room in the entire complex, a far cry from the glittery hives of commerce. But there was soul in it. He opened the visitor's book and leafed through its ledger-sized pages, reading the comments scribbled one beneath the other by travellers from all over the world. They didn't disappoint him. They never did. Today's entries alone filled 3 pages. Some were in Chinese characters or Arabic script, but most were in English, halting or otherwise. The Lord was here, poured forth in this welter of biro ink and felt-tip pen. It always struck him, whenever he was at an airport, that the entire, vast, multi-storied complex pretended to be a playground of secular delights, a galaxy of consumerism in which religious faith simply did not exist. Every shop, every billboard, every inch of the building, right down to the rivets and the toilet plug holes, radiated the presumption that no one had any need for God here. The crowds that queued for snacks and knickknacks, the constant stream of passengers recorded by the closed-circuit TVs, were wondrous proof of the sheer variety of human specimens, except that they were presumed to be identically faithless inside, duty-free in every sense of that word. And yet, these hordes of bargain hunters, honeymooners, sunbathers, business executives preoccupied with their deals, fashionistas haggling for their upgrades. No one would guess how many of them ducked into this little room and wrote heartfelt messages to the Almighty and to their fellow believers.
Thank you, Michel. So if we just sort of quickly backtrack from your latest novel itself to maybe talk about the backgrounds of you coming into publication, your early life, that kind of thing, just to give us a sense of where you're coming from. Your early life is really quite unusually varied in terms that by the time you were in your mid-30s you'd already emigrated twice. Mm-hmm. You'd emigrated from Holland to Australia as a young boy, sure, and then from Australia to Scotland in the early 90s. So do you think it's fair to say that that has influenced in some way the sort of thematic concerns you're writing? I'm specifically thinking about maybe the ideas of like alienation or displacement.
I'm sure that's true, and another factor which may be linked to the migrations, particularly the sort of forced migration when I was 7, mm-hmm, is that I have no recall of my very early life. So I think a lot of authors mine their past for material, and I think it's often true that people, and particularly writers, return to the times in their life when things seemed to matter most, when they were just discovering their first love, or first realizing that people die, or first starting to figure out how the relationship between their mother and father might not be what they had imagined when they were a baby, and so on. And that's very strong material for a lot of writers, and it fuels their narratives and their understanding of the world. I can't do that. I don't have that. Mm-hmm. All those childhood memories are a blank for me, and I have very few teenage memories left. My young adulthood is hazy, and really, as I live, it's as if my memory is a window that moves, mm-hmm. and as it goes that way, I lose more of that. And that really influences the kind of writing I can do. So I make it all up. Mm-hmm. I have to make it all up.
Yeah, it sort of makes your writing constantly move with you as your perspective moves and your memory moves.
That too. I mean, it is writing that metamorphoses all the time, mm-hmm. and I am always moving on to fresh territory. But it also puts the pressure on me to conjure things out of nothing, and I just have to trust that when I'm making up these narratives, mm-hmm. featuring invented people and invented or places that are not familiar to me, that I'll still be getting access on a deeper level that I don't understand to things that I've experienced. It's just that I can't in an autobiographical, technical way tell you what those experiences were.
Mm. It's very interesting. Following on from that, would you say that nationality is important to the way you think about identity, or do you ascribe sort of more unique qualities to self-identity than something that's as broad as nationality?
Well, I don't feel as if I have a nationality. I only lived for 7 years in Holland, mm-hmm. and I don't remember it at all. There are some values I have that I have since discovered are quite Dutch. There's a directness about various things, including mm-hmm. the way the body works, that is clearly not British.
Yes.
I couldn't claim to be Dutch. I grew up in Australia and was educated there, and it was a great place to grow up. I got a really good education there, and it was multicultural, it was interesting, mm-hmm. but I don't feel Australian, and I'm not a Scot, clearly. I mean, one of the problems for me with the first novel, Under the Skin, with doing public readings, is that whenever there was a bit that had a Scottish person in it, and Icily in the book picks up Scottish hitchhikers, I wouldn't be able to read their voice because I can't do that. So that alone sort of is a big tip-off that I'm not Scottish, and obviously not English either. So what nationality I am, it's up for grabs. Whatever people think.
Yeah, sure. Is it true? I've read a story that your publishers tried to get you to become a British citizen in 2001 for the Booker Prize, because at that time the Booker Prize was you could only enter your book if you were a Commonwealth citizen.
Yes. Yes.
This is for after the
Crimson Petal and the
publisher,
White.
The Crimson Petal and the
Yeah. The Crimson Petal and the White, I can understand why they wanted me to be eligible for that prize, because it is the sort of book that might conceivably, have had a chance.
Yeah.
And they were telling me, look, it's you can still be Dutch. You can have dual citizenship. It's no big deal. Mm-hmm. And they would have been very happy if I could have done that. But it was precisely at that point that Britain was following the USA into the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
Yes. And
it was just the wrong time, in my life for me to be waving what I felt would be waving a little British flag, mm-hmm. saying I'm one of you now, when I was so disgusted by that whole enterprise. So, yeah, I didn't do it, and that's
yeah,
the way it was.
Yeah, so it was really this sort of big political sort of stance that you took, almost, that you didn't do it, because there is that kind of political slant to some of your work, especially I'm thinking sort of Under the Skin, for example, is sort of like darkly satiric of big business, as well as it is about representing the other sort of alien narrative. So is that important, that sort of political slant that you bring to your writing?
It got increasingly important for me for a while, and in the few years following the Crimson Petal, I went on all the anti-war marches and I wrote journalism for the Herald, protesting about all this stuff, and clearly the role of writers and artists and intellectuals was total impotence. There was nothing we could achieve, and politicians don't read anyway, or they read bump that's given to them by their advisors, but they're certainly not going to be reading proper books. And after a while I got very despondent, very demoralized at the role that writers could have at times in history when very, very unwise and unfortunate things are being done. So I actually withdrew for a long time from the literary scene. I went into an extended sulk, if you like. I didn't go to any literary events and didn't write for a long time, and just stayed at home in the Scottish Highlands, simmering. And then in 2008, my wife was diagnosed with incurable cancer, and I knew that her opportunities to travel and to have adventures would be very limited. And in the past, literary events had always been almost an excuse for us to go to a different country or a different part of Britain and to meet nice people and see different landscapes and just have an adventure. And I started saying yes again, so that she could come with me. So we went to some events in Scotland, and we went twice to Italy, and we went to Utrecht in Holland, and to China, to the Beijing Literary Festival. And after those things, she became too ill to travel. But it meant I was back into the literary scene or the literary circuit or whatever you call it. And here I am. She's dead now, very sadly, but I think she would have liked me to continue saying yes, which is why I'm sitting here talking to you.
Yeah, no, it's a very sort of touching thing to sort of refer to your literary career as almost like an adventure. Your writing enables you to go to all these places and see all these people that otherwise you might necessarily not be able to do. Thinking about that sort of thing, that sort of public side of the writer, obviously you've already sort of touched upon your feelings about the war on terror. You wrote a piece called Dreams in the Dumpster, Language Down the Drain about the Iraq War in 2006, but you've also written pieces...
I also wrote a novella called Bombshell about all that, and I told my publisher that I was writing it, and he got very excited, and he was already planning what it was going to look like and how he was going to publish it. Yeah, we'll do it as a little paperback, but it'll have flaps, etc. He was thinking ahead. And then when I actually sent it to him, he really, really didn't want to publish it. And it was a novel full of the anger that I felt about Britain's involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was all set in Britain, but it used various devices, basically to make you feel as ashamed as you possibly could be. And it it took the reader to a very, very dark place and just dumped them there. There was no light, no hope, no transcendence. It was pure viciousness on my part to the reader in order to almost make it impossible for them to behave that way again, like an extreme kind of conditioning, if you like. And, you know, part of me wishes that book had come out. No one would have ever bought anything by me again. I can assure you of that. If they had read, you know, if they bought it and, the new Michel Faber book, I like the Crimson Petal so much, you know, they would never, ever have touched anything of mine again. But if I could have changed the way people voted, maybe. But I actually don't think writers can do that. I don't think it's in their power. And from another point of view, I'm glad it didn't come out, because I care about my readers and I want them to feel that they can trust me, and they wouldn't have felt that they could trust me after that one.
Well, that's what I was going to go on to ask you. That's sort of touching on humanitarian issues. Like, you also have written articles about say the HIV/AIDS crisis in Ukraine in 2005. Do you think that sort of public aspect of the writer, the sort of social awareness that can be political or humanitarian or both, at times, do you think that's important of being a serious contemporary writer that has something to say?
I think one of the wonderful things about fiction, and literary fiction in particular, is the sheer variety of approaches and voices. So I don't think there's any onus on serious writers to prove that they are serious by writing about war or any other, you know, topic of current discussion. I think you can be just as serious a writer and write about fantastical things that are purely in your own imagination and that don't seem to connect with the world out there at all. So, yeah, I wouldn't be judgmental of any writer writing about anything. Sure. It's the concern for me is that the writer wants to put things into the world that are not just using up trees and, you know, wasting paper. But what exactly is in the book is really for them to decide.
So you don't feel that there's this huge sort of social responsibility on writers necessarily to voice opinions about things that they think are, you know, socially unacceptable. But do you think that because you're a writer, because you're established and you have this audience that you've already mentioned, do you think that gives you this sort of stage to be able to do that, whereas otherwise you wouldn't necessarily? People are more willing to listen to you because being an author and being a respected author in some ways is quite a sort of privileged position.
I think there's a great many writers who have shown a great deal more interest in engaging with political issues and with trying to change society than I have. So I really think I'm very small fry in that area. I think that writing generally, serious writing, literary writing, one of the things that it could potentially achieve is that the reader becomes more mindful of understanding the other, the person who is not like them. Yeah. And going on from that interest, from that sense that there's a world of human beings out there who function very differently from me, and I want insight into them. Maybe if someone truly intuits that, they would be less interested in bombing someone in another country that they've never met, who speaks a language that they don't understand. You know, that's the... I know that's a very small ambition for literature to achieve, but if it can achieve that, maybe that's as good as it gets.
But it's small in the example, but it's not. It can be much more universal than that. It doesn't have to be about bombing someone from somebody else's culture. It can be about cultural sensitivity as well on a much sort of broader scale. But anyway, just sort of backtracking slightly, I was going to ask you, sort of as an offshoot of me mentioning the sort of satirical edge that you sometimes put into your work, and there was a really, really funny short comic strip that you wrote with Roger Langridge called Art and Anarchy. That I
It wasn't actually supposed to be called Art and Anarchy. It's just that when the Guardian first approached me, they were talking about an exhibition of comic art, which was Art and Anarchy, and all our emails just kept having that title, because you know how emails just continually keep the first title. A huge chain. Yeah, and I never noticed that they evidently thought that was the title of the comic. I never chose a title for the comic.
But well, I mean, I think it's.
You think it works as Art and Anarchy?
I think it's quite an interesting title, especially there are some in-jokes involving Alan Moore in the sort of art, and he's of course got this huge sort of background and political affiliation with anarchy. But I mean, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's basically the story of Barack Obama and David Cameron meeting in a comic shop.
Yes.
And then Obama sort of explaining US foreign policy within the American tradition of comics writing, which is about superheroes, which is about these almost sort of vigilante figures, these righteous figures that operate outside of the law. So I mean, I wanted to sort of ask you, because I'm studying a module on comics that involves people like Alan Moore in this semester, so I wanted to kind of ask you how much awareness you had about comics history, or how much of that came from Roger.
Everything in that comic except for the visuals and the costumes was me, and I it was fully scripted.
Yeah.
I'm a huge comics fan and have a very, very large collection of comics. Particular areas of interest for me are Marvel comics of the 1960s, particularly during the period when Jack Kirby was inventing everything. And then in the 70s I sort of lost interest in mainstream comics somewhat, and got very heavily into American underground comics. And in the late 70s, early 80s, I was particularly interested in feminist comics, lesbian comics, all those minority comics that were being produced by the American underground. And then in the 90s, very interesting graphic novels started coming out. And in the 2000s, Marvel got interesting again. It started reflecting the way the world was changing in an interesting way. So, for example, when we had the paranoia about terrorism and people coming from other countries in order to destroy our way of life, in the whole Marvel universe, you had the Skrull invasion, where these shape-changing aliens who could look like us were infiltrating our culture and sabotaging us from within. And then when there was the elation with Obama getting elected, suddenly comics got sort of all upbeat and cheerful again for a while, and you actually had comics with Spider-Man and Obama meeting each other. And then disillusion setting in, and you had this huge story arc in Marvel called Dark Reign, where it was terribly depressing because all the people that you had thought were heroes were in fact terribly corrupt and drug addicted and alcoholic and in league with the mafia and whatever. So we're at a stage in history again where you can almost look at history unfolding through the lens of the narratives in superhero comics. So that was interesting again for a while. And again, it's a very rich period for graphic novels, just the last few years. So I've got representative things from all those eras, and then a lot of foreign stuff as well, because I'm very interested in French comics and Dutch and Belgian comics and Italian comics. So come to my house. You'll have a good time. I'll show you some things.
So obviously you're very interested in comics, but as a medium, is it something that you're interested in exploring yourself further in terms of writing?
there's a Dutch book by Willem Hermans, one of the great Dutch writers, and it's called Het Behouden Huis, which means something like the safe house. Mm-hmm. It's extraordinary novella, but there's some padding in it, and I've done a translation of it into English, and I'm in a quandary there because I want to cut out some of the padding, but you can't do that, if you're translating a book. But if you're adapting it as a graphic novel, you can. Yeah. So I'm thinking of getting together with an artist, and then I can sort of trim the script more, and I can bring his novel to an English readership, because it really deserves to be discovered by people in this country, and I could get to work with a graphic artist.
Yeah.
So that's something that might happen in the medium term.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting, because comics adaptation from literature to the graphic novel form is really quite an interesting one, because not only can you cut out things, but you find ways to visually represent things, and the writer can have a lot to do with that as well, because if you approached it in the same way that Alan Moore does, then you're going to be writing paragraphs and paragraphs per panel, basically, of comics. Are you tempted as a writer to approach it in that really detailed way? No, I mean, there is that extraordinary book From Hell, where Moore is describing everything that has to be put into each panel of From Hell. And it's clearly impossible. He's clearly mad. There is no way. And yet, he does it. I'm more realistic about what can be achieved in each panel. So I'm sure Roger Langridge would, not have horror stories to tell you. But I do think that a collaboration between a writer and an artist can add up to more than the sum of the two. Yeah. And I would be hoping that we could do something like that. But I don't have a particular artist in mind at this point. No, sure. I think, that's absolutely true. Sometimes it creates this sort of, perhaps unintentional, but there is this tension in the text sometimes between the image and the actual written word.
I mean, with Alan Moore stuff, I'm actually not a huge fan of From Hell, partly because I'm not a big Eddie Campbell fan. What attracts me to comics is actually not the script usually. It's the artwork. Yeah. It's the artwork that turns me on. And he's a perfectly good artist. I'm not saying he's no good, but we all have different tastes, different flavours that we like. And I'm not an Eddie Campbell fan. The Alan Moore stuff that I really, really love, he did a whole range of comics called America's Best Comics. And it was things like Tomorrow Stories, Tom Strong. And virtually every one of those comics, and there were zillions of them, they were all exactly what I wished comics could still be. Yeah. They were hugely inventive and generous-spirited and odd and thrilling and witty. For the period that he was producing those, month after month, I'd be thinking, Alan, you are compiling a body of work here that's very impressive. Whereas with something like From Hell, I guess partly because I'm not interested in serial killers, at all. Like, I don't care who Jack the Ripper was, and I don't know why anyone would want to know who Jack the Ripper was. Yeah. Anyway, we've digressed.
Yeah, we've got overexcited with comics slightly. So getting back on point, maybe the issue of genre in your work. I said when I was introducing you that Under the Skin, when it was released, was described as sort of genre defying, and that it doesn't necessarily slip into any of the genres that obviously influence it. It isn't completely science fiction. It isn't completely sort of thriller. It isn't completely horror, etc. So I mean, if I were to walk into Waterston's with one of your novels, I can't place it in one of those sections. It has to go under F for Faber, really. Is that your way of sort of keeping your novels unique in a sense, and not having them sort of adhere to all these genre conventions? Is that very conscious?
Well, I would love all the books to just be under F, as you say. In a review that David Robinson wrote in The Scotsman, I think, he said that every now and then a book comes along where you don't want to tell someone anything about it. You just want to say, trust me, read this. Don't ask me what it's about, just read it. And I would love all my books to have that status with the people who love them and the booksellers who are selling them. Because what I really want to do is take the reader on a journey to the unexpected, and for them to start reading the book, have no idea what it's going to be about, what genre or genres it will be, and even when they're beginning to read it, not knowing where it will take them, but just trusting me that it will take them somewhere interesting, somewhere thrilling, and somewhere transcendent. The journey will be worthwhile for them. But we live in the real world. Books have to be classified. Booksellers have to put them in a particular place. Various kinds of websites have to put a genre title on them. And I guess one of the few good things about the word literary fiction is that it's so vague. Yeah. All it really is alluding to is that the book is going to be well written rather than badly written. And I think even that's a bit of a misnomer, because there's a lot of really, really crappy literary books out there. But yeah, there is this expectation that it's going to be done to a high standard, and everything else is up for grabs, and that's good.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we've already talked a little bit about the medium of your writing, albeit we've talked far too much about the comics medium. But you recently said that the book of Strange New Things is going to be your final novel, and in some ways it is a farewell to the novel as a form.
Sure.
So I mean, is that sort of correct? Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a farewell to many things. It's a farewell to our planet, if you like, because it addresses all the things that we have done to our poor planet, and it's a farewell to my wife, who died shortly after I finished it, and in a kind of Prospero breaking his staff kind of thing in The Tempest. It's a farewell to novel writing. And I think I've produced enough. There are quite a few books out there. I think if someone wants to spend a great deal of their life reading Michel Faber books, there's quite a stack of them. And the short stories as well, which I'm very, very proud of. There are people who read only novels and don't read short stories. Yeah. And if this is the last novel and they truly are hungry for more Michel Faber stuff, then maybe they would investigate the short stories in the end. I never wanted to be the sort of author who just puts out books because that's what I do. Every few years it's about time Michel Faber put out another book. I felt I had a certain number of books in me that would all be different from each other, and I think I've pulled that off as many times as I can pull it off without beginning to repeat myself. And yeah, it's enough. Yeah.
No, well, was that a decision? Obviously, it's well, in some ways maybe it wasn't a difficult decision for you if you felt sort of emphatically about it. But is it a decision that you took during the writing of it or before the writing of it? Did you have an inkling that this would be your last extended sort of prose?
I knew when I was writing the Fire Gospel, the book before this, that it was my second last. Right. And I knew when I was writing this that it was the last. And my wife was very grieved about that. Partly because she was always a never say never kind of person. but also because she wanted there to be more books by me out there. So that was a point of sorrow between us. But as she read more of the book, because of course she read it chapter by chapter, as I was handing the chapters over, she understood more and more the various things the book is a goodbye to. And of course, once she was dying, looking back on it, dying, the fact that the book was also a farewell to her became understandably very meaningful to her. So yeah, I for all sorts of reasons, I think it's appropriate that it's the last one.
Yeah, I mean, it's. You said there, you don't want to fall into the trap of repeating yourself. You don't want to be one of those authors that just has, oh, it's September, it's time for another Faber novel. It's not so much a dissatisfaction with the medium of the novel. No, it's just a case of you sort of feeling that you have said what you want to say in that medium. I mean,
whenever journalists or critics or authors talk about how the novel is dead, or what comes after the novel, I heave a sigh, because there's young people coming up all the time who are going to reinvent the wheel, and that's good. That's what young people are for, to reinvent the wheel. And history is a huge sifter, and a lot of the novels that are being written now by the Philip Roths of the world, who are considered to be the be-all and end-all of literary fiction, a lot of that stuff's going to be forgotten. Just statistically, it has to be forgotten, because almost everything does disappear down the plug hole of history. And it may be that there's some young people working right now who are 24 at this moment, who are writing a novel which is destined in 100 years from now still to be considered meaningful and to be read by people. We can't predict that. History will take care of that. And I suspect the novel form has a lot of life in it yet. But my particular bit of that history, I think I've done what I needed to.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite admirable in some ways that you don't want to sort of overstay your welcome, as it were, because you have sort of this feeling that after the Crimson Petal and the White came out, it was of course a huge success, particularly in America, and there was sort of the inevitable rumblings of, is he going to do a sequel? And it's something that.
Well, I was talking about short stories a minute ago. People would come up to me in signing queues when I'm signing, autographing the Crimson Petal and the White.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got to write a sequel. We're desperate to know what happened to Sugar.
Particularly because of the ending of that
novel.
Yes.
And Sophie, we love these characters so much. And I would say, well, actually, I've written a book of short stories called The Apple, about these characters at different points in their lives. Some of them set before the time of the novel, some a great deal after, blah, blah, blah. Their eyes glazed over, not interested, because it's short stories. Yeah. And what they want is a novel. And I don't understand that, because to me, a story is a story, whether it's 2 pages long, 20 pages long, or 200. But for some people, it just has to be a novel. And as I was saying a bit earlier, if those people truly are hungry for more, then who knows? Maybe they will. If there are no more novels, maybe they'll end up reading The Apple, which would be nice, because there's some very good stories in there.
That'll cause them to dig deeper, as it were, and go beyond. Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I was going to ask you. So, I mean, if this is your last novel, are you going to return to the short story form then? Is that something that you are definitely sort of going to go back to and explore again?
I certainly wouldn't say no to writing more short stories. And if in time I have written enough stories of sufficient quality to fill a collection, then there might be another collection of those. I'm writing poetry at the moment, dealing with the grieving process of having lost Eva, and Eva left behind a great deal of writing of her own in various states of completion, some of it almost final draft, and some of it little more than notes, and I might collaborate with her posthumously on that material. We did discuss this while she was still alive. I don't know whether I'll be able to. She had a very different mind from me and a different style, and I'd want to honour what she was trying to achieve. So it's possible that in time I'll be able to do something along those lines. And there are also non-fiction books that I might wish to write, which would not be of interest to most people. They would be very specialist. And by then it'd probably be time for me to die, because males in my family don't live very long. I don't think there's been a male in my family that's lived longer than 60, so I'm 54 now. So I think that'll probably keep me going until whatever.
So it's quite interesting that you mentioned there to do with the crimson petal and the white, that a lot of people were very interested in the novel, but they weren't necessarily interested in reading the apple. And you say a story is a story, whether it's 2 pages long or 200 pages long. Do you think there are any? What do you think sort of the mental blocker is about short story? Is it more sort of literary, or is it considered to be more literary in some ways, or are there sort of more nuanced differences in the way that you would maybe approach writing a short story than you would sort of writing a full-length novel?
Well, there's two aspects. There's the public's relationship with stories and the writer's relationship with stories, and you're touching on both of those. I think that in order for short stories to be revived, it's really up to the reader. I mean, often publishers are blamed or bookstores are blamed, but ultimately people vote with their feet, or whatever part of them is engaging with books. And I think if more people signalled that they really want to read short stories, then there would be more of them. In terms of my relationship with writing them, I've never worried about the length of a thing when I approach it. I listen to the narrative to see what it wants to be, and sometimes that's just one page, and that's then optimal for that piece of fiction, and sometimes it's 5,000 words, and sometimes 50, and sometimes 500,000 words, and that then gets tricky when you interact with the world, because, for example, short story prizes, they will have an upper ceiling of 2,500, 3,000 words. So it therefore means if you write a short story that's 6,500 words, there's nothing you can do with it. You can't submit it to short story prizes, it's too long. You can't send it to magazines because they'll all say it's too long. It can't be published as a standalone book because it's too short. And for me, that's not a creative problem, that's a marketing problem. But what it means, of course, is that there's a lot of people out there whose ideal form might be the 6,500 word piece of fiction. And those people are not writing that. They are either writing something that's shorter than they really need to be writing in order to truly show you what they can do, or they're pumping air into it, like just gas, to expand it into something that can be sold as a novel. And there's an awful lot of padded novels out there. I know that they could lose 200 pages easily, but then they'd be too short for marketing purposes. So I think that's a problem that as a culture I hope we can address one day. It's really not an ideal situation we're in.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. So maybe at this point it would be a good idea to become slightly more specific about your most recent novel.
Yeah. That's your way of not having to say the Book of Strange New Things.
That's me having to say the Book of Strange New Things instead of say the Strange Book of New. On to the Book of Strange New Things. I nailed it that time. So I mean, I think it's a really beautiful novel, but it perhaps deals with issues of love and faith in a much more direct way than some of your previous work. Do you think that's a fair comment?
Yes, I think that faith is... In The Crimson Petal and the White, you've got two characters who are very sincere, committed Christians, Henry and Emmeline, but they are subsidiary characters. And most of that book is about sexual politics, really, about... It's driven by a very feminist motor. And in the 199 Steps, it's partly set in a monastery, but it is very much about something else. And I'm addressing issues of faith in the Fire Gospel, but that's partly a satire of the publishing industry, and that the religious element of that is like a subplot almost. Whereas this is very squarely dealing with what religious faith does for people, and what the lack of God means. So yeah, I think it's a fair comment that it's more direct.
Yeah. So I mean, I was going to go on to ask you about the sort of sexual relationship stuff, because I mean, generally in your work, it's presented in some ways quite sort of unhealthy ways, but in this, Peter and Bea, their relationship, it seems, you know, much sort of stronger, much sort of more full of, more hopeful.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, you know, even though there are these sort of intellectual differences that sort of mark their relationship at times, and there's this obviously this huge sort of geographical gap between where they are, and that puts a certain amount of strain upon the relationship, as it would for anyone. But was it very important for you, thinking about this novel as a novel that is really about saying goodbye to a lot of things, as representing this very sort of hopeful, strong relationship?
Yeah. I mean, even before Eva was diagnosed, I had already been becoming, bizarre syntax of that sentence. I had already become uneasy about how many of my stories, how many of my books seem to be presenting a view of sexual relationships that was quite not cynical, but sorrowful in the sense of people just can't get it together. You know, they even if they care about each other, it just doesn't work, or they're exploiting each other, as William and Sugar clearly are, or as the married couple in The Courage Consort, they've just been married too long and she's become someone else and they're really estranged from each other, and so on. So I felt I was in danger of becoming an author who was almost peddling this idea that sexual relationships are just doomed.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, I had this 26-year marriage with Eva, and she loved me very, very much, and I loved her very much, and we had enormous respect for each other. So I thought it was time that, you know, a novel of mine paid homage to the possibility that people could have that sort of relationship. So even before she got ill, that was very much the plan for this book, that these people would truly, deeply love each other. But then, of course, it became charged in a different way when it was clear that we were going to lose each other.
No, I think it's a really strong aspect of the novel. I really liked it. But going back to what we talked about initially, about ideas of your sort of emigration informing your writing, once again there's sort of the issue of sort of lives that are lived in a sort of transient space going on here. even the section that you read out earlier with the sort of airport stuff and the really nice sort of observations about the prayer room, and even on driving on the way to the airport, you've got another sort of hitchhiker standing at the side of the road, which almost sort of signals back to Under the Skin.
Yeah, of course it does.
Is that something that's really fascinated you, the sort of transient aspect of living?
I think I have different agendas for each book, but in this book, without wanting to give too much away about it, one of the things that grieves me is that we have tended to treat this planet as if it is a transient stopping off place that we can trash on our way somewhere else. And of course, there's a whole tradition, particularly in science fiction and in very intelligent writers like William Burroughs, who ought to have known better, that space is our future. We were born to go. We're going to migrate to the next place. And I don't think it's going to happen, and B, I think that if it were to happen, we wouldn't be able to cope. I think we need to think very carefully about how we can remain here and live out our time here, rather than assuming that we can just trash the earth and go somewhere else. And the personnel who are living on this alien planet they're transients themselves. Yes. They're emotional and intellectual transients, and that when you get to know them better is actually quite scary, because it's a very special kind of person that can live with that kind of rootlessness.
One of the most intriguing aspects of the novel for me, anyway, sort of as an English student, is the playful use of language. And I mean, to a certain extent, in previous novels like Under the Skin, you've sort of played about with the idea of sort of language and alien perspectives, and alien perspectives on our language. Here, the sort of aliens seem physically, they're unable to make some of the human sounds, some of the sort of really onomatopoeic sounds like the cha or this, so Peter sort of embarks on this process of rewriting biblical stories, almost like he's trying to set up like an oral tradition of sort of reading and storytelling of these in their culture. And he presents this really, he presents a speech which is written in their language. So, I mean, did you sort of do any detailed work in constructing any kind of understandable language for them, or any sort of grammatical structure for that? Or is it
are you asking, do I have a glossary hidden somewhere?
Yes, have you got a Tolkien-esque English that you've made up?
I don't know what it means.
Right.
I don't know what they're saying to each other. I don't know what it means.
Yeah.
And I want the reader to want to know what it means, but not to be able to. Mm-hmm. I want that frustration. Yeah.
No, I think it's a really sort of nice playing about. They're almost like you see like partial words and they're sort of scribbled out particular letters. I think it's a really sort of effective way of doing it. But I mean, maybe this is me placing too much emphasis on certain elements. But there seems to be a somewhat conscious allusion to perhaps Heart of Darkness, or a sort of wider Conrad influence in the novel. Not only in terms of the sort of colonisation of the other, as it were, but there's the disappearance of the previous missionary who's called Kurtzberg.
Yes.
So was that something that you were?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've read Heart of Darkness. In fact, Conrad is usually I read just one book by each author. In almost all cases, I just read one. And in his case, I read two: Heart of Darkness and The Secret Agent. So I must have liked him. It was a long, long time ago. The Heart of Darkness is in there, and of course, Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Heart of Darkness in a Vietnam context, is in there, and that's what that Kurtzberg thing is alluding to. But it also alludes to Jacob Kurtzberg. Jacob Kurtzberg was the true Jewish name of the man who renamed himself Jack Kirby. and produced all those amazing Marvel comics in the 1960s, and basically made up everything that you've been seeing on Hollywood screens for the past 10 years or something, but didn't get any money out of it.
Yeah, so it's almost like a sort of double nod in sort of two different directions to like some really influential people that you've sort of looked at.
For me, I think that a good novel, you should be able to zip along the surface of it and be turning the pages, curious to know what happens next. And then it should have lots of layers, which if you're inclined to reread it or you're inclined to think more deeply about it, you can dig and there'll be more to find. But it shouldn't get in the way while you're reading it, on the surface. That's what I've tried to achieve with all the books, and equally so with this one.
Sure. So, talking about alien landscape for a minute, the landscape of Oasis is very, very barren, and especially in the sort of contrast with sort of Beatrice's narrative of the natural disasters that are happening on Earth. Is there a sort of overt environmentalism that's going on in there?
Well, there again, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of climate change. The book is not predictive in that sense. But I'm using climate change and natural disaster as a metaphorical wake-up call for people to cherish what it is that we have while we've got it. And that's not just in the case of the planet, cherishing the planet more before we possibly lose it, but also cherishing our own bodies, because they are very miraculous things too. And I think we have too little appreciation for the bodies that we've been given by nature or God or whatever has given that form to us. It's pretty extraordinary that we have it, and we should treat it better, I think.
Yeah, I've watched a couple of interviews where you describe the human body as like a fleshy vehicle. It's this sort of, it's got this fragility about it almost. And again, there's that sort of transient narrative, the moving through. But finally, because I am sort of conscious that time's getting on, your work has been adapted several times. There are several adaptations now of your work out there that are sort of creeping into the public consciousness more and more, perhaps. So, just as a quick recap, in 2011, The Crimson Petal and the White was adapted into a 4-part miniseries for the BBC, and then you've got the Jonathan Glazer movie version of Under the Skin, which was put on general release in the UK earlier this year, and it did quite well. And the book
did extraordinarily well for such an experimental film.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was released in America as well, although I think it was a much more sort of tighter sort of release. It wasn't on general release, but then again, it did very well for the proportion of sort of cinemas that it was in. And already the Book of Strange New Things has been adapted into a set of 15 radio segments for BBC Radio 4.
Yes, and it's going to be a TV series, I'm told.
Right. So, I mean, is this sort of new interest, or this continuing interest in your work as adaptation, is that flattering or is it distracting for you in terms of going forward?
It's neither. Well, in terms of going forward, it's the last novel, so I don't know how we can define going forward there, but I've been very pleased with the adaptation so far. I've been very, very lucky. As if you've studied the history of adaptations of books, the usual thing is for the author to be bitterly disappointed. So, it was a very, very strong TV series, amazing film Jonathan Glazer made. There was also a delightful stage adaptation of the Fahrenheit Twins. It was adapted by a theatre company called Told by an Idiot, 2-person, and very, very different in spirit from my story, but tremendous fun. Eva and I were both so happy, sitting in the audience for that. So I have been very lucky with adaptations. Jonathan Demme wanted to do a film version of The Courage Consort. Was very, very keen to do it and wrote a script for it. And that didn't happen. So I'm a bit disappointed that that didn't happen, because I think he would have made an interesting film. But, you know, life came in the way for him. Mm-hmm. But yes, I think I've been very, very fortunate. And maybe part of the reason why I've been fortunate in that area is that I've totally left them to it. I haven't got involved. I haven't tried to write the scripts. I haven't meddled in the process at all. I've just let them do what it is that they do, and gone to the cinema when it's ready, or you know, watch the DVD on my computer in the case of The Crimson Petal, because I don't have a TV. Mm-hmm. And I've been delighted each time.
Yeah, no, well, that's what I was going to sort of ask you next. Is, you know, I mean, are you perfectly happy to leave people to sort of adapt in their own way rather than getting involved yourself in writing screenplays, or even sort of in an advisory role?
Well, you know, the history of literature since the invention of cinema has been a history of bitter disappointment. Yeah. And writers never seem to learn from the humiliations of previous writers. They all think it's not going to happen to them. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just felt it probably would happen to me if I got involved, so just step back. Yeah. No, that's. I think you know, I've watched the TV series. I've also seen the film, and I think, you know, they are very good. Even though they are sort of, yeah, especially the films, are much more sort of loosely adapted, perhaps, than the TV series. But Michel, it's been a pleasure. So once again, thank you very much for your time. All the best for the coming event this afternoon at the festival, and for wherever your work takes you next. So thanks. Thank you.